When I saw wolf tracks side by side with human footprints, my breath caught because I realized he hadn't been hunting, he had been guarding. I had stepped into the forest at first light, axe over my shoulder, thinking only about the dwindling woodpile on my porch. The snow was powder dry, squeaking under my boots, and the air was so sharp it felt like the inside of my lungs might frost. Nothing seemed out of place, until the path bent toward the frozen creek and the ground began to speak. At first I thought I was looking at the usual story the woods tell after a night storm: deer slots, rabbit hops, the casual scribble of a fox. But then a deeper groove appeared. Bare human souls, 2 little pairs and 1 larger, stamped into the crust in a wavering line. My stomach turned. Nobody should be walking here barefoot, not with the thermometer buried below 0. A dozen paces farther on, 4 clean paw prints slipped into the line like punctuation. Wide, round, heavy, wolf. The pads pressed so deep they'd glazed to ice, and each claw mark gleamed like a needle. I knelt, gloved hand hovering, afraid to disturb the shape. The wolf prints didn't cross the human ones. They flowed beside them, stride for stride, as though the animal had matched their rhythm on purpose. I followed, uneasy. Every few yards I expected chaos, a spray of snow where the chase had ended, a tangle of blood and fur and frantic heel marks. But the surface stayed smooth, almost ceremonial. The woman's steps drifted, sometimes listing, sometimes steadying, and always the wolf adjusted, curving to bracket her, then swinging back to flank the children. Not once did the paw prints overlap the smaller feet. They circled them instead, patient, protective. The trail reached a wind-snapped birch, paused and, impossibly, turned back toward the village. That made no sense. If the wolf had been stalking them, why retreat? Why guide them rather than hound them into the ravine where deer freeze each winter? Snowflakes hissed against my coat as the wind shifted. I pictured a gaunt predator pacing behind 3 shivering figures, lips peeled from its teeth. I swallowed hard, told myself a single animal couldn't plot anything grand. Instinct was enough. The forest is brutal, never benevolent. It was simpler to believe the beast had shadowed them for the kill and, for reasons beyond me, missed its chance. I told myself the story ended there, all straightforward, just a wolf on a trail. I almost turned around. Almost. But the prince kept whispering, "Look closer." I crouched again, letting my eyes comb the pattern. 3 tiny shapes, toe, 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 nested exactly between the great front paws, over and over, as if the creature had angled its body to shelter the smallest child from the wind. The picture lodged like a splinter behind my ribs. 3 small footsteps between 4 enormous paws. He walked beside them, not after them. The axe handle felt suddenly heavy. Absurd. I could see the woman trudging, shoulders sagging, children half frozen, and a lone gray shape melting in and out of the storm, never letting them drift beyond reach. I could almost feel his breath roll over their backs, like steam in the blue-white dawn. A jay screamed overhead, jolting me upright. The forest waited, indifferent yet expectant, and the trail stretched onward, inviting me deeper. Questions pounded. Where had the family gone? Why had nobody sounded alarm? How did a wolf become a sentinel for strangers? Another gust rattled the branches, and snow showered my coat, but I was sweating now. I followed the returning tracks, every step an argument between reason and something older. Reason snarled, predator, scavenger, end of story. Something older murmured, protector, guide, thread of mercy in the ice. The path doubled back toward a clearing I knew, the place locals call Silent Notch, where the ground dips and the wind dies and sound carries like prayer. As I approached, the air grew still enough to hear my pulse. The prints slowed there, the children's feet zigzagging, the woman's imprint growing lighter, as if she'd paused to rest, and always the wolf pacing, drawing invisible circles. Then the tracks resumed, pressing uphill toward the ridge that overlooks both the village and the endless pines beyond. They ended abruptly at the first rise, snow smoothed over by yesterday's gale, leaving a white expanse as blank as an unsent letter. I stood alone in that hush, the forest pressing against my eardrums, and knew the trail had offered only its beginning. The ending was elsewhere, tangled with lives I hadn't yet met, and choices I couldn't guess. My breath smoked in the pale light, and in it I saw the shape of the beast, trotting just ahead, ears flicking backward, waiting to show me what came next. The wind rose again, whispering through dead ferns, and the hush broke like thin ice. I tightened my grip on the axe, not for protection, but for courage, and stepped after the vanished prince, the open question burning a hole through every certainty I had ever carried out of these woods. If I'd known what waited beyond that ridge, I might have turned back then and there. But the forest was already closing behind me, and the wolf's silent story was far from finished. The tracks ran thin as I climbed, then vanished beneath a crust of wind-drifted powder. Even so, I kept walking, guided by a memory as sharp as the mountain air. Years ago, hunters spoke of one wounded gray that refused to leave these valleys. His pack was gone, trapped, shot, or scattered, but he endured, scar-striped, solitary, moving like a rumor through the pines. I had dismissed the tales back then. Now every bootstep felt like trespass into his long, private vigil. Brush thinned, revealing a weather-blackened shack on a knoll. The old hunting blind locals abandoned after the state banned baiting. Its roof sagged under snow, door hanging askew. Something in me tightened. This was where the woman's trail must have led when the sky turned lethal. I breathed once, lifted the latch, and stepped inside. Cold twilight pooled in the single room. My eyes adjusted, and the first thing I saw stopped me. 2 tiny scarves, striped red and pale blue, draped over an upturned crate like offerings. One corner of the red knit was chewed ragged, as if small teeth had worried it for comfort. Beneath the scarves, the floorboards were sanded smooth by recent traffic, little bare heels, slipping knees, and, clearest of all, broad paw prints stamped into the grime like wax seals. I crouched. The pads had pressed through a film of melted snow, leaving 5 perfect toes, the claw points etched in wood. No human could fake that weight. I traced a groove where the wolf must have turned, shoulder brushing the crate, before circling. The hairs on my neck lifted. I could almost feel him still moving past me, silent as falling ash. A mildewed shelf ran the length of the back wall. Snow sifted through a broken window, dusting everything white. On that shelf lay a haunch of venison, neatly gnawed but far from finished, its exposed flesh still pink beneath a glaze of ice, and next to it, a scattered clump of coarse gray fur snagged on a nail. On the snow-covered shelf, meat, and next to it, wolf fur. He had fed them. The wolf had fed people. The thought struck like metal on flint, throwing sparks across every certainty I carried. Wolves take, they do not tithe. Yet here was tribute, offered in the only currency a predator owns. I rocked back on my heels, heartbeat drumming in my ears. Instinct tried to stitch a simpler story. Some kind soul must have trekked up here with meat, trying to keep the family alive. People do strange things in blizzards. I told myself, surely a human had been feeding them, all ordinary, explainable. The words tasted thin even before they formed, because the evidence kept muttering its refusal. Deer fur scattered in clumps far too large for a child to butcher, claw gouges scoring the doorframe where something massive had shouldered inside. The musky scent of wild canine woven through the chill like rough thread. No boot treads printed the floor, no cigarette butts, no thermos rings, only paw and barefoot predator and preyless refugee, choreographing an impossible alliance. Snow sighed against the tin roof. I stood, throat tight, and pictured that wounded lone wolf dragging fresh kill through moonlit drifts, wedging it onto the shelf with his jaws, while two frightened children clung to their mother in the corner. I could hear his breath, ragged, determined, and see his ribs ripple under winter-thin hide each time he laid down food he desperately needed himself. What law of tooth and hunger made room for such mercy? A low plank creaked behind me. Reflex spun me toward the doorway, heart hammering, but nothing stood there except the empty hush of furs. Shadows stretched across the threshold like dark water. For a moment, I almost expected amber eyes to ignite within them, patient and unafraid. Instead, only wind entered, stirring loose scarf fringe and lifting a snowflake swirl that settled upon the venison. I realized I was trembling, not from cold, but from the enormity of what these walls had witnessed. Predator guarding the helpless, delivering sustenance like a silent covenant. It cracked something open inside me I hadn't known was frozen. I shut the door softly, though no latch could keep out what moved here. Outside, daylight was bleeding away, and the sky flushed copper over the pines. I should have gone home then, told the sheriff, fetched blankets, done anything rational, but the trail felt warm beneath the snow, pulling me deeper. Somewhere ahead, the woman and her children still breathed because an old wounded wolf had chosen compassion over hunger, and I needed to understand why. I stepped back into the twilight and followed the paw prints leading downslope through the drifts, each stride a question that rewrote the wilderness I thought I knew. The forest absorbed me without answer, but I could feel its heart beating differently now, steady, enormous, and utterly alive with possibility. The clearing lay silver under a rising moon, and I hunkered behind a fallen spruce, breath clouding the night air. I had followed the prints until they dissolved into hard-crusted snow, then waited, half convinced the forest would stay mute. Wind rattled the dead tops, crows settled into black knots overhead, and time thinned until each second felt like a pulse in my palms. I told myself I was here to gather evidence, yet the truth was simpler. I needed the world to prove whether mercy could truly walk on four legs. A soundless shape blurred between tree trunks. I blinked, thinking my eyes had stitched shadow into substance, but the silhouette grew, carving itself out of the darkness. Broad shoulders, narrow hips, head carried low. The lone wolf stepped onto the moonlit snow, as if surfacing from another century. Scars cross-hatched his flank, and one ear was notched to the base, a fighter, long past his wars. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and lifted his gaze to mine. Amber met human, and the distance between predator and witness collapsed into a single silent question. He looked at me as though asking not to interfere, and I froze. The forest around us vanished. There was only the faint rise of his ribs and the throb of my own blood. He did not bare his teeth or lower his tail. He simply watched, measuring something deeper than fear or hunger, something I could not name. Then movement flickered behind him. Two small figures eased from the tree line, children bundled in two thin coats, faces pale under moon glare. The boy clutched the girl's hand, and both leaned unconsciously toward the gray giant as if he were a wall against the night. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The wolf stood between them and me, guardian and gate alike, and the little girl raised her free hand in a timid wave that broke my heart more cleanly than any claw. I opened my mouth. No sound. I wanted to call out, to promise safety, fire, soup, blankets, anything to ferry them back to ordinary life. My lips formed the mother's name I'd heard in town, but the wolf's ears twitched forward, and my voice withered. Under that steady gaze, I felt like a trespasser in a chapel. What right had I to drag them from a miracle still unfolding? Slowly, deliberately, the wolf turned. Snow whispered under his pads as he nudged the children toward a covert path I hadn't seen. They obeyed without hesitation, feet shuffling through the crust, eyes fixed on their strange escort. The boy glanced back once, confusion and faith warring on his face, then vanished beneath the dark lattice of branches. The wolf brought up the rear, pausing a final time to look at me. Question answered, covenant sealed, before melting after them into blackness. Silence dropped like wool. I remained crouched, numb, listening for laughter, for footsteps, for the crash of pursuit. Anything. Nothing stirred except my heart, ramming against its cage. Moonlight glittered on untouched snow where they had stood moments before. I told myself it had to be a mirage. Snow glare, exhaustion, nerves singing after too many hours alone. Surely children were tucked safe in farmhouses by now, and that battered wolf existed only in campfire gossip. Yet when I finally rose and stepped forward, I saw the proof printed clear as letters, small boot marks overlapped by perfect paw impressions. The trackway curved toward the hidden path exactly as I had watched, each indentation crisp and irrefutable. Knees weak, I reached out and touched one paw print. Ice rimmed the edges. Warmth still lingered in the hollow. My fingertip came away damp. No fever dream leaves melt off in its wake. A barred owl hooted overhead, dragging me back to the present. I straightened, snowflakes slithering off my coat, and scanned the trees. The night yielded nothing except the faint hush of retreating wind, as though the forest itself wished to protect their passage. The sensible part of me screamed, "Follow them, you fool!" But another voice, quiet and old, whispered, "Witness is enough. For tonight." I pictured the wolf guiding those children through moon-washed corridors, nose testing the air, body angled to shield them from every bitter gust. I felt smaller than I ever had inside these woods, smaller yet somehow more alive, as if my bones now rang with secrets older than speech. When I finally turned back toward home, dawn was already bruising the eastern sky. The clearing behind me looked ordinary again, just snow and shadows. But each step I left felt heavier than the last, anchored by the knowledge that the impossible no longer hid in stories. It walked the same ground, breathed the same air. If fatigue and moonlight could conjure illusions, they could not leave those tracks, and they could not explain the way that scarred wolf's eyes had asked, begged me to let the mystery move unbroken. I carried that gaze with me down the ridge, its weight both burden and blessing, certain of only one thing. Whatever I thought I understood about the wild, I had just stepped beyond the edge of it, and there was no path back to ignorance. I didn't sleep. I lay on the narrow cot by the stove, listening to every groan of timber, every hiss of wind under the door, replaying the clearing like a reel that refused to click off. Each time the wolf's eyes met mine, I felt the same jolt, part warning, part trust, until doubt crawled over certainty and back again. By dawn, my thoughts were raw wires sparking in the dark. When gray light finally seeped through the frosted panes, I shrugged on my coat and opened the door for air I hoped would clear my head. I almost tripped over the body on the step. A snow-dusted hair lay there, limp, but still warm enough to steam faintly in the cold. Blood glimmered raw at the throat, the kill perfectly clean. No human had set this here. The prints circling the boards were unmistakable, wide, deliberate, the claws scribed deeper than frost could fill overnight. I stared, pulse throbbing behind my ears. He had fed them, and now he was feeding me? Why? The question hung between the stiff ears of the hair like a tag I couldn't read. My stomach flipped. I hadn't asked for this, yet turning away felt like spitting on a covenant bigger than language. I lifted the animal with both hands, sudden heat of its last breath seeping through my gloves, and carried it inside. Part of me argued it was coincidence, scavenger habit, anything but intent. I told myself he must have vanished, that all of it was over, yet the fresh kill hissed on my table, refusing that easy ending. The decision came as simple as opening a door already ajar. I dressed, grabbed a burlap sack of jerky and 2 cans of beans, and headed back through the timber, snow squealing under my boots. The sky was flawless blue. Last night's storm had scoured the world clean, as though to make room for whatever bargain the wolf and I were about to strike. The old hunting shack crouched beneath a drift, window glass sparkling like mica. Inside, moon shadows were gone, replaced by a stark beam of daylight and the faint smell of pine and musk. I set the sack on the shelf where the venison had lain, splitting the jerky into neat strips, opening the cans and leaving their metal lids folded back like petals. Little enough, but it felt like placing an offering on an altar whose God did not want praise, only partnership. I stepped out, closed the door softly, and pressed my palm against weathered wood in a wordless promise. More would come. Then I turned for home, snow glittering like powdered glass across the clearing. No movement stirred among the trees, yet the nape of my neck tingled as though watched. And somehow that was comfort, not threat. All afternoon I chopped firewood, the hair simmering in a pot I barely tasted. Evening bled into violet, then ink. The forest remained silent, no howl lifting above the ridges. Doubt tried to crawl back in. Maybe he'd offered the rabbit only to tide me over while he led the children farther from these hills. Maybe my food would sour in the shack, untouched. But before the first star brightened, a low shape loped across the tree line beyond my cabin. I caught only a sliver of gray against deeper gray, felt rather than heard the press of his paws. And then he was gone, folded into night like breathing itself. A hush dropped over the clearing so profound I could hear a single flake land on the stacked logs. I exhaled, long and shaking. Whatever story had begun between us had not reached its final page. It wrote itself now in tracks on fresh snow, in gifts passed back and forth like secret messages, in the silent understanding that neither of us would break the fragile thread connecting predator and man. Inside, the pot bubbled. I ladled broth into a tin cup, raised it in the dim kitchen the way my grandfather had toasted absent friends, and whispered to the dark window, "Thank you." If the forest answered, it spoke below the threshold of human hearing. Yet, I went to my bunk lighter than I'd felt in years, knowing dawn would draw me once more along that hidden path where fear, faith, and something wilder than either walked side by side on 4 scarred legs. Morning cracked open with the news riding shotgun on every breath of village gossip. The woman and her 2 little ones had been found alive at the edge of the southern meadow. I heard it first from Old Man Reeves, who trudged up my path for kindling and couldn't keep the tremor out of his voice. They were skinny as fence rails, he said, clothes stiff with frostbite, yet standing, because something in that forest had refused to let them lie down and die. I left the axe buried in the chopping block and followed the current of townsfolk surging toward the clinic. Inside, kerosene lamps painted trembling halos over rough cedar walls. The older boy sat wrapped in quilts, cheeks raw, eyes bright as river stones. His sister dozed against her mother's shoulder, a sparrow of a girl, fingers curled around a length of gray fur like a rosary. The woman raised her head when I stepped in. Her gaze snagged on mine with a recognition that pierced straight through my coat. She croaked a greeting, voice spent from screaming into too many starless nights, yet her words carried a weight that stilled the room. We weren't alone out there. He saved us. Murmurs rippled, pity, disbelief, the quick sideways glances people trade when truth stretches past comfort. The town leaned closer, expecting a human rescuer, a trapper, a hermit. Instead, she spoke of the wolf. She told us how, the first night after her husband slammed the door and snow erased their tracks, she had huddled the children beneath a spruce. Moonlight flashed on eyes in the dark, and terror clenched her throat, until the beast dropped a freshly killed rabbit at her feet, then backed away, ears flat but gaze unwavering. How he returned night after night, dragging deer haunches, grouse, even a slab of beaver still steaming. How, when the wind howled hardest, he pressed his body against the children, ribs shuddering with each labored breath, sharing the furnace of his life because they had none left. Her hands shook while she talked, but her eyes never wavered. He breathed on them when they were freezing, she said, and tears glazed the rim of her lashes. She said, he breathed on the children when they were freezing, and my eyes stung. Someone laughed, nervous, brittle. Another clucked that starvation breeds hallucinations. A third offered the tidy comfort of angels. But the boy lifted his quilt and showed the print of a paw on his coat, pressed there in frozen mud like a benediction. Silence clamped down. I felt every beat of my heart then, slow and thunderous. The vision from the clearing flared back, scarred gray shape flanked by two small silhouettes, and my lungs tightened with something like reverence. They weren't phantoms. They were here, flesh and pulse, because that battered old predator had chosen duty over distance, compassion over the clean arithmetic of hunger. The physicians shooed us out so she could tend to frostbitten toes. Outside, gossip sprang up again, louder now, eager to trample the impossible into more comfortable shapes. They said she was raving, head cracked by cold, weaving fairy tales to hide her shame. Everyone laughed, claimed she was delirious, but I knew better, because the scars on that wolf's flank matched the memory in her son's eyes. I broke away and walked until the houses thinned, and the first pines rose like dark watchmen. Snow sifted under my collar, but warmth flickered in my chest. Not the good hearth heat of certainty, but the fierce, bright ache of witnessing a miracle no argument could smother. Somewhere beyond those trees the old wolf still moved, ribs hollow, task unfinished, and I wanted to shout thanks loud enough for the hills to carry. Instead, I stood in the hush and whispered it, letting my breath plume upward, a small, human offering. Then I turned back toward town to fetch blankets and broth, because the story he had started wasn't done, and the least I could do was carry it forward on two clumsy legs. The evening bells began to toll across the frozen roofs, calling the faithful to prayer. I answered by loading my sled with food, stepping onto the moonlit track the wolf had once walked, and feeling the ground under me hum with a promise too wild for words. The flames were small, just a ring of broken pine branches crackling in the lee of an old rock wall, but they threw enough light to paint the woman's face in shifting gold. We met on the pasture edge at dusk. After the doctor agreed she and the children could walk a little to shake the cabin stink from their lungs. The sky above was iron blue, the air brittle with that hush that settles before deep night. I crouched opposite her, the fire and amber river between us, not sure who had more questions. She warmed her hands first, knuckles swollen and red, before reaching behind to guide her boy forward. He was perhaps 8, eyes too old for that small frame. Wordlessly, he lifted his pant leg to the knee. A fresh, rope-thin scar zigzagged above the shin, angry and pink against the frost-pale skin. Then, with a shy courage, he turned his calf outward so I could see another mark. Bruised, oval, the size of a wolf's jaw but centered higher, just below the back of the knee. "He yanked me," the boy said, voice grave as a judge. I slipped on the rim. He grabbed my pants and pulled. His mother touched his shoulder and finished the tale. The cliff south of Silent Notch, a ledge hidden under snow where the boy had tumbled. She'd been 2 steps behind, numb with panic, when the gray shape barreled past, teeth clamping cloth instead of flesh, hauling the child backward with a force she could only describe as desperate tenderness. Her eyes lifted to mine, shimmering in the firelight. "That wasn't a beast," she whispered, as wind stirred sparks up like frantic fireflies. "That was a guardian." The word carried weight I felt in my chest, a bell tone that seemed to ripple through the night air all the way to the tree line. I swallowed, but said nothing, because speech felt brittle. The forest behind us lay black and motionless, yet every brittle branch seemed to hum with the echo of her naming, Guardian. As if the role had always existed, and we humans had simply never thought to assign it to Fur and Fang. She shifted closer to the flames and lifted a mug of broth I'd carried from the house. Steam wove around her cheeks like bright ribbon. "He kept the coyotes off too," she added, voice low. "They circled at dusk. He circled back, never let them close." She stared into the cup, and the soft lines around her mouth trembled. When Charlie cried in the night, the wolf nosed his hair until he slept. Behind her, the little girl curled on a blanket, clutching that tuft of gray fur. The boy eased down beside his sister, gears of exhaustion grinding slow. The mother exhaled a shuddering breath and said what must have been burning her tongue since rescue, "I need to say thank you to him. I don't know how." The pine crackled, resin popped. When she spoke that gratitude, a sudden clarity sliced through me. I could never hunt again. The realization felt as physical as the chill earlier, yet hotter, fierce. My rifle resting above the hearth, my lifetime of pelts and horns, they all seemed to belong to another man. I rubbed my palms together, tried to hide the tremor. I told her the shack stood stocked now, that if the wolf returned, food would be waiting. She nodded, gaze drifting toward the dark hills where his shadow moved somewhere beyond our weak fire. "He'll know," she murmured. "He knows everything out there." For a moment the scene stilled, mother watching the horizon, children breathing slow, frost painting our breaths white, and I felt the expanse of forest behind me like the nave of a vast cathedral, arches of spruce, stained glass moon above, where a lone, scarred congregant prowled the aisles, tending his own wordless liturgy. I wanted to bury this night, forget it, live forward in tidy daylight, but the scar on the boy's leg glowed in memory, a map of the wolf's impossible mercy. Forgetting would be treason. A gust bent the flame sideways. Embers fluttered, and in that blaze burst a single clear howl from far across the ridge, low, resonant, then fading into nothing. The boy's eyelids slid open, and the mother's hand found mine, nails biting through glove leather. No other cry followed, yet we knew he was out there, alive, still keeping watch even as our small fire wavered. "Guardian," she repeated, softer than a prayer, and the word feathered into the night like breath on glass. It lingered between us long after the last log gave way and the children slept, long after we banked the coals and walked back toward town. It lingered in me still, echoing every heartbeat, as pledge, as benediction, as gentle order to set my rifle down forever. Spring cracked the ice on the creeks and turned the ridges the color of new pennies, yet one thread of winter still tugged at me. I had not seen the gray guardian since the night of the howl. So on a dawn washed pink with early swallows, I slung my empty pack, no rifle now, only a canteen and a spade, and followed the old game trail into thawing woods. The snow was gone, but the ground kept his memory, deep-pressed prints petrified in mud, the last he'd left before melt. I moved from one to the next like stepping on ghost heartbeat. For hours I climbed, crossing runoff streams that fretted and sang until the air shifted. A hush descended, thick as breath held too long. Ahead, sunlight poured through a break in the spruce, lighting a circle of meadow fresh with first grass. And there he lay. The wolf's body rested on its side, paws tucked, muzzle cradled on the crook of one foreleg, as peaceful as if sleep had simply deepened into stillness. His scars had faded to faint stories under silvered fur, eyes closed, lips uncurled. He had lain down in the grass as though he knew everything was done. I knelt, pulse hammering. No mark of struggle, no broken limb. Just the hush of completion. A breeze lifted his guard hairs. They glittered like spun wire in the sun. Then I saw the bones. Beside his flank, in a neat crescent, lay delicate avian relics. Hollow wing bones, wishbones, leg shafts, bleached white, and arranged with deliberate care, tips pointing inward like petals. Small enough to be sparrow, robin, jay, maybe gifts from hunts traded with the children, maybe trophies he'd saved for this ending. A final offering, curved toward his own ribs, as if he were returning every breath he'd borrowed from the forest. I swallowed hard, throat burning. Part of me wanted to search for cause, age, injury, hidden wound, but another part understood inquiry would cheapen the grace here. Some stories close themselves. Still, habit spoke its defense. I thought, he's dead, and that's the end. Neat line drawn, circle finished, lesson over. I even felt a flicker of relief. But the meadow's hush pulsed, telling me the narrative hadn't sealed. It had simply turned a page I hadn't read. I cupped my hand over his shoulder. Cold already, yet the shape felt firm, real, refusing myth. I said aloud, "Thank you," because anything else seemed foolish beside those bird bone petals. My words stirred a lark that lifted from a nearby stump, spiraling into blue. First voice I'd heard since sunrise. Grief slid through me, sharp then soft, braided with wonder. I should have cried. Instead, I found myself smiling, because even in death, he taught, power can bow to tenderness. Wild hearts can choose guardianship. I dug a grave beneath a sapling birch where runoff wouldn't wash the earth away, lining it with fresh moss. Rolling him in my coat, I felt the surprising lightness of his frame. Starved, yes, but somehow it seemed he had shed weight on purpose, the way a man lays down tools after finishing a roof. I placed the bird bones on his chest, laid earth over fur, and planted my spade upright like a mute headstone. No epitaph could say what the hush already proclaimed. Clouds thickened. A single drop spattered the mound. I glanced up to find the sky crowded with dark wings, crows drawing slow circles but never diving, as if paying respect. The wind changed, bringing the smell of rain and something else, fresh pine pitch, the scent that clings when wood heals its wounds. I stood, brushed soil from my palms, and felt a strange calm settle. Whatever force had guided him to feed the helpless had guided him to this gentle rest. The season would close over him with fern and violet. Stories would spread, twist, forget. Yet a mother and 2 children would breathe spring air tonight because he had chosen them over himself. That truth would linger in their lungs every time they laughed. I took one last look, the small mound, the solitary birch, the watching crows, and turned for home, pack still empty. The forest behind me felt wide open, pages fluttering. Somewhere under the swell of thunder, another life might already be answering the silence he left. And if it was, I knew I would follow, because I had stepped too far beyond the edge of old knowledge to ever walk the ordinary trail again. We returned 3 evenings later, slipping from the last farmhouse lantern into a hush of dripping firs. I hadn't told anyone where I'd buried him, but the woman, Emily, caught my unspoken direction, and the children padded beside her without question, as though their feet already knew the way. Rain had mended the forest since that dawn, moss plumped, fiddleheads uncurled, and the birch above the grave shimmered with newborn leaves that trembled like small green bells. I carried a rough pine box in my arms. Inside lay scraps of jerky, a painted wooden toy car the boy had outgrown, and a strip of the red and blue scarf, each treasure chosen in secret. Emily's hands clasped wildflowers, trillium, violet, a single cardinal bloom, petals bruised by haste but still bright. The little girl clutched a pocketful of fresh-dropped pine cones, holding them so gently, resin glistened on her palms. We stepped into the clearing, and the mound of earth waited, round, undisturbed, except where hooves of curious deer had pressed soft crescents along one edge. I knelt first, setting the box at the head. Earth smelled sweet, almost honeyed. Emily crouched opposite, laid the flowers in a fan across the moss, and traced the soil's curve with trembling fingers. No words came. None were needed. Evening light gathered like smoke, and wind nudged birch leaves into a soft clatter that sounded uncannily like breath. The boy crouched, studying the mound as if reading a page no adult could see. Then, solemn as a priest, he lined his pine cones in a crescent mirroring the arc of bird bones beneath. His sister added hers, tiny brows knitted in concentration. When they finished, the boy stayed kneeling, one hand resting flat on the earth. A minute passed. 2. The forest held its lungs. At last he murmured, half to the ground, half to us. He was better than Dad. The words hit like the crack of a distant rifle. My heart stumbled. Emily's shoulders shook once, but she steadied, pressing her palm atop her son's, sealing the confession rather than denying it. I thought that was the end. Last tribute paid, circle closed, grief gentled. I told myself we'd turn back to village paths and ordinary twilights, but the wind shifted, carrying a low rustle from deeper woods. The shuffle of pads over wet leaf litter, cautious yet unhurried. I straightened, eyes narrowing toward the shadowed trunks. A young wolf stepped into view, sleek, charcoal dark, eyes pale gold. Smaller than the guardian had been, unscarred, muscles fluid under fresh coat. He paused just beyond the birch, head tilted, nostrils tasting our scent. Emily's breath hitched. The children froze, fingers still on pine cones. I raised a hand instinctively, not to ward him off, but to honor whatever bridge he'd come to cross. He padded forward, one measured step, then another. When he reached the mound, he lowered his head, nose brushing moss where violets now lay. He stood like that, silent sentinel, for a heartbeat that felt like an oath. Then, with a gentle motion I would have sworn impossible in a creature his age, he nudged one pine cone into neater alignment before backing away. Moonlight slid through cloud rags and lit the mask of his face. His gaze flicked to each of us in turn, calm, assessing. Not predator, not pet, but something older, aware. A message passed I couldn't translate, a torch lifted wordlessly from one bearer to the next. Then the youngster stepped into the trees, swallowed by dusk so quickly I wondered if night itself had conjured him. The girl whispered, "Is that him?" Eyes wide, voice quavering between awe and longing. Emily shook her head slowly. "No, sweetheart, but maybe he learned from him." Her words fell soft, yet the clearing seemed to take them in, roots to crown. I knelt again, palm flat where the boys had been, feeling only cool soil and the faint pulse of my own blood, but I imagined warmth radiating upward, a relay flame moving birch to wolf, wolf to child, child to sky. And in that instant I realized the story hadn't closed. It had budded, ready to leaf out again in new hearts. Night finally spilled through the canopy. We rose, turned toward the faint village glow. Behind us, flowers glimmered atop the grave, pine cones guarding like small brown sentries. I looked back once more, half hoping to see the young wolf watching, but the clearing was empty except for birch leaves whispering secrets to the dark. We walked home in silence, yet the hush between us thrummed, not with loss, but with the fierce, tender knowledge that somewhere in those black corridors another guardian had taken up the watch, carrying forward a mercy wide enough to cradle even the hurt a father had once left behind. The night was so still, I could hear the creek turning over stones half a mile away. Even the porch boards seemed to hold their breath. That's why the sound cut me open so cleanly. A single howl, high, bright, echoing off ridges that had never carried wolf song in my lifetime. I jerked upright in bed, boots half-laced before my mind caught up. The old guardian was gone. No pack haunted these hills, yet the cry lingered, sliding through the chinks of the cabin like moonlight. I stepped outside, lantern unlit, letting the dark swallow me whole. Frost had silvered the grass again. Spring can be cruel that way. The howl rose a second time, closer now, floating from the abandoned logging road above the birch grave. My chest tightened, both terror and an ache so fierce it felt like longing. I followed the sound, breath clouding, heart hammering like I'd run a mile though my boots barely whispered. Halfway up the slope the trees parted, revealing a ribbon of moonlit track. And there he stood, not the scarred elder I had buried, but a young wolf, coat sleek as wet charcoal, eyes pale gold. He stood square in the path, ears forward, tail level, neither threat nor surrender, simply presence. For one heartbeat I froze, believing winter's hush had conjured a ghost. Then he blinked. It was the same deliberate blink I'd seen months ago in that first clearing. Slow, sure, as if weighing me, then setting the weight down gently. The gesture hit like a hand on my ribs, and everything inside me cracked. I felt tears brim, hot against the cold, because at that moment I knew the bridge between worlds hadn't broken with one lone heart. It had been handed onward. I didn't believe, I whispered, voice shaking, but I saw it myself. He passed something on. You remember? The young wolf cocked his head, as though the words mattered. Behind him the forest breathed, vast and unseen, yet I sensed other shapes shifting deeper in the pines. Life stirred by his call, answering in silence. Compassion doesn't end when a body lies down. It seeds itself like pine after fire. Wind lifted, carrying his scent, rain, moss, a faint trace of sapling birch. He stepped closer, one careful pace, paused silent on grit. My knees buckled. I dropped into the ruts of the road, tears spilling, because mercy from the wild was standing 3 yards away, and it was more than a heart built on bone could hold. I covered my face, shoulders shaking, hearing only my breathing and the quiet tap of his claws on dirt. A sudden, sharp memory flashed. Emily's voice by the fire. He breathed on the children when they were freezing, and the boy's small verdict at the grave. He was better than Dad. I understood then that this new wolf carried those words the way seeds carry entire forests inside tiny husks. If your heart is pausing right now, you understand, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell the truth. Nature is full of mysteries. When I lowered my hands, the wolf hadn't moved. He watched me with that patient gravity only the wild can teach. Moonlight etched every guard hair, and I swear I saw a faint scar beginning to form along his flank, like the first line in a future story. He blinked once more, same slow assurance, then turned, trotted up the road, and slipped between silver trunks. No drama, no final look back. He had shown what he came to show. For a long time I knelt in the ruts, the night humming around me. I thought that was the end, lesson delivered, curtain down, but another howl rose farther off, then another, lighter voices weaving under his. A budding chorus, not yet a pack, but promise enough. Nature was stitching guardians out of new cloth, and I had heard the first thread pulled tight. I stood, wiping my face, and felt the land differently under my boots, not backdrop, but companion. The creek's chuckle sounded like agreement, the wind through spruce like low applause. I walked home without lantern or fear, the road glowing faint as milk in the moonlight, every shadow alive with the possibility that pain might yet summon protection, that kindness might prowl on quiet paws where no one thinks to look. Back inside, I banked the stove, then opened the window wide. Night air swept in, cold, wild, electric with distant song. I whispered thanks into the dark, not sure who or what might hear, but certain the message would find its way. If you believe in a special bond with animals, write, "We are not alone in this world."